So why did we have a previous conference on women and maps, and why am I still talking about it? You think that we might have done that, but no, we're still talking about it. First of all, thanks so much to the British Cartographic Society for inviting me to speak. That's much appreciated. It's my first BCS conference, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And thanks, of course, to audience members in advance for your help with the project. So as I was saying, TOSCA needs you. We're just finalising our publication, and we really need your help in tracking down women involved in cartography, especially pre-21st century people. It's a pleasure to see women in the audience today, so we know there are lots of practitioners, lots of interested people now, and it's really people before this century that we're very keen to know of. So again, thank you in advance. So some of you may be thinking, well, isn't this all a bit old hat that we've known that women are underrepresented in cartography for a while? There have been various blogs, there have been a couple of exhibitions about this. There's even been a monograph about this excellent book which came out in 2013. So do we really need this project? So, yeah, I think we probably do, actually. So it's lovely to see members of the audience of both genders today, but I noticed that I'm the only female speaker today. So maybe we do need this. Maybe we do need this. This is another monograph which came out by the excellent Bo Rittenberg, but it was about the treasures of cartography, and it was boldly titled Men Who Mapped the World. So, and it wasn't presented as a partial history, it was presented as a comprehensive one. And I think we still do know relatively little about women's involvement in maps, and there are some general problems with the historic record that we'll go into as we go along. So I think that it is worth talking about, and certainly worth asking for your help with. So there are various ways of thinking about women and maps, and there's some ways into the topic there, and we're going to go through them systematically to see what we might say about them. So first of all, maps by women. Yes, there are some, and there are probably more than you'd think, but there are quite clearly constraints. There have been, and there still are constraints on women map makers. In previous centuries, in very many places in Europe, apprenticeship might be a route into the map production, to production of maps, and women in many places simply couldn't be apprentices. A particular problem was that married women in a lot of places couldn't own property. That was true in Britain until the middle of the 19th century. The Married Women's Property Act reformed that. But the point of about that is that because married women couldn't own property, they couldn't run businesses. So single women could, and widows could, but married women couldn't, because they could run up debts and their husbands would be liable for them. So actually no one would trade with them. And they could simply repudiate debts. So, and this was a really big constraint on women when there was pretty much universal marriage, and women at their economically most productive time were most likely to be married. So this is why we get a lot of widows in the map trade. It's not simply because they bumped off their husband or they have this sort of more longevity. It's actually to do with the laws of property. And interestingly, I don't know if anybody's been to the or planning to go to the Chanel exhibition at the V&A. There's some nodding heads there. Interestingly, she always maintained that she couldn't ever marry. So well into the 20th century in France, because if she did, she'd lose control of her business to her husband. So maybe even after the formal restrictions on women owning property had gone, maybe social customs actually still made things difficult for married women. So this was a major constraint on women in mapping. And of course, as in the 19th century, late 18th century, 19th century and beyond, as surveying and mapping got institutionalized, these institutions were predominantly male: Ordnance Survey, militaries, and so on. So that sort of further consolidated and maybe even more profound in many ways, this gender division. Notoriously, in all branches of history, it's really difficult to track down women. Their lives were simply much less recorded than were men's. But we do find that women were involved in map making in all sorts of ways. They were suppliers of data, they were to map makers, they were makers of maps themselves, they were engravers, they were colorists, and they were commissioners of maps. So they are there if we look for them. In all sorts of ways. So, for example, we all know about Ortenius's maps, but in fact, his sisters, Elizabeth and Anna, were busy colouring maps. The work was largely anonymous. It's recorded in other documents, but they were involved in the map-making process. Mary Ann Roke, again, she may be a name you're familiar with. More people will be familiar, I think, with her husband, John Roke. And this was a sort of classic thing. She was born into a French Huguenot family, the Scarlet family, who were a big map-making family. She married another French Huguenot map-maker, John Roke, and was anonymous right up to that, to the time of his death, when a widow, so she can now own property, she carries on his business. And partly she carries on seeing through the projects he'd started, but she also is involved in other businesses in her own right, and she's a manager of the business. And obviously you can't, when you're widowed, you don't suddenly acquire all the skills that you need to commission a map and run a map-making business. So it's obvious that she and very many other women had been involved anonymously in their husbands' businesses. I think I skipped a map. No, here I didn't. This is a map where the maker of the map, Mariana Wilmot, this is an embroidered map on silk. She is the map maker. Interestingly, she's not classified in the museum catalogue as the map maker. She's described as being involved as a signature, but she's not described as a maker. So this is a sort of example of when women are hidden in the process of map making. But it's interesting that she's making this map, and we can read what we like into it. Was this actually an exercise in making her quiet and dutiful while she did her embroidery? Or was it an exercise in spreading geographical education? We'll come back to that when we talk about dissected maps later on. Here's another map from the mid-19th century, moving through time here. So this is from the 1846, and it's signed S. Hall. But who is S. Hall? Is it Sidney Hall, who is a relatively well-known engraver, or is it his, yes, you guessed it, widow, Selina Hall, who carried on his business after his death? So this is use of initials, obviously makes tracking down women very difficult, but they are there if we look for them. And thanks to Debbie Hall, my colleague at the Bodleian, for alerting me to this map. Another woman that you might have heard of as a map maker, there's some controversies around her, Phyllis Pearsall. She told us that she tramped the streets of London to make her A to Z. Well, perhaps. Peter Barber thinks that this is a good story, but not strictly conforming to the truth in all respects, and that suggesting that her father, Alexander Gross, was maybe more involved than is normally credited. Nonetheless, it's interesting. She was involved, and she was a very, very good publicist, for at the very least, for her maps, even though we may not ever quite know what her involvement is in the map making. But it's interesting that there's a kind of mythology grown up about this map, and she managed to create publicity which was very much to the commercial benefit of the company. So the women involved in map making aren't always progressive. This is a truly ghastly map, which I think is supposed to be amusing, by a lady. A map of the open country of woman's heart, exhibiting its internal communications and the facilities and dangers to travellers therein. So it's a highly sentimental, moralised, and totally ghastly map. So we mustn't equate women's involvement with progressive ideas. This is a classic thing we need always to avoid. So women were involved in actually the making process, but we're perhaps more used to seeing women not in the signature line of a map, but as icons or emblems on it. And there are a few, this is a cartouche, and we're kind of used to seeing this, and we kind of filter out its meanings in a lot of respects. Because what we really notice once we start to look at this is that there are very many women in these cartouches, and they've almost all forgotten to get dressed. And so we see here a sort of classic example of a male cartographer on this side here, and he's looking strangely like a Greek philosopher there with beard, so clearly not only well educated but wise and educated in the right way, carrying the tools of his trade. So underneath, a woman who is associated with fertility, because she's carrying this cornucopia, and she has forgotten to get dressed, as has the other woman on the side there. So this is a kind of classic trope, and they're not really contributing anything to the map by a man. They're making it allegedly more attractive. And these are tropes that we see sort of time and time again, and they generally get worse. Here is some women who not only have forgotten to get dressed, but this is a woman representing Europa. She's on the back of a bull there who represents Zeus, who is actually abducting and going to go on to rape her. So this is obviously a very thought to be a very pleasant image for the cartouche of this map. But once we start thinking about that, that's really rather troubling. So clearly it's part of a whole trope in the visual arts in general. Here we have a particularly sort of elevated example of that. There's a Titian, which you can go and see if you're in Boston. And I was speaking to my classicist colleague about this, about why women feature so strongly on maps. And clearly it's, on one level, it's part of a sort of tradition where you can get away with erotic imagery if it's dressed up as classical learning. But there's actually a Greek grammatical reason why a lot of abstract qualities are represented on maps and imagery in general as women. We can go into that at the end. I find it fascinating, but maybe that's an acquired taste, so I won't delay us now. But it's actually directly related to Greek grammar and to the grammar of Proto-Indo-European languages in general. So there's an interesting historical reason for it, but I think when it comes to having women as icon on maps, we're used to seeing them as decorative, and we're used to seeing them in ways which are actually quite troubling once we stop to think about it. So maybe it's a good thing actually to pause when we look at those cartouches. Related to that are maps depicting land and sea as gendered. Here we have Europa, Regina Europa, as we've seen in the last map, is traditionally personified as a woman, and here this is a rather regal image. So same grammatical trope that we're dealing with, but perhaps less eroticized. But on the other hand, there's a gender difference. So we have, here we have Napoleon, and he is sort of partially composed of a map, but clearly in a rather militaristic way. So there's clearly gender differences then in representation. So that's maps by women and maps depicting women, but there are also maps for women. And for that, we have to go outside written evidence in many cases, looking at material sources, including, of course, the maps themselves, the prime source that we need to think about, but also visual sources showing people with maps, which I think as cartographers, we haven't used perhaps quite as much as we might do. So there were there were women who commissioned maps. So here you'll recognize a sort of pretty standard nice 18th century estate map, and the landowner in this case is a woman, and so the map itself doesn't look any different than it would do for a male landowner, but we can see this sort of gendered title page here with some pink ribbons, which we wouldn't have for a man. Now, I'm afraid I can't remember offhand if this lady, yeah, she's a widow. so that, as we all now know, that the widow, she can hold the land, so she commissions this. So it doesn't affect the maps, but it affects the presentation of the maps. And here we have a very nice 18th century dissected puzzle of England and Wales, so Thomas Kitchin map made into a beautiful dissected map, still in its original box, which is really lovely. So these were made for children, obviously. They were, some of them, it was clear that they were to be used with an adult tutor who might have been male, but increasingly were female governesses taking over. And it's clear from other sources that these were used by girls as well as boys. I don't know whether you know Mansfield Park, but there's this nice sentence in there where the ghastly Bertram sisters are busy patronising Fanny Price. And they say, dear mamma, only think my cousin, that's Fanny Price, cannot put the map of Europe together. So obviously a dissected puzzle that the ghastly cousins can do, but poor old Fanny Price can't. Or my cousin cannot tell the principal rivers in Russia, or she's never heard of Asia Minor. Do you know, we asked her last night which way she would go to get to Ireland, and she said she should cross to the Isle of Wight. So there we can see sort of clear evidence here of the ghastliness of these Bertram sisters, but we can also see that girls' education was involved geography. They were expected to have some knowledge of geography, and we can see that they were expected to glean that from maps of various sorts, including the dissected puzzles of the sort we've just seen. So these were maps intended for girls as much as boys. And when we come to other visual sources depicting maps and globes, we're very used to seeing those in depictions of men, and they're sort of, sometimes they relate directly to the profession of the man, but quite often they're there as kind of studio props. You know, got to look manly, so you've got to have your hand on the globe as if you're controlling the world and so on. This is a sort of standard trope that people talk about, but actually if you look much more closely, there are plenty of images of women where a map is thought to be an appropriate background. So sometimes these are studio props. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this Vermeer, this allegory of painting, where the sitter, the woman in the background, a map is thought to be an appropriate background for a woman in that instance. Maybe we can say this tells us as much about the painter, as is Vermeer himself, as well as the act of painting. So maybe it's telling you that Vermeer is erudite enough to have a map. But nonetheless, the sitter is a woman, and it's not a feminine prop, it's a map. And there are many, many other, especially early modern Dutch paintings, genre scenes, showing maps in the background. Here we have a pretty humble household represented here, and not young, fashionable people. They're respectable, but they're pretty economically marginal people. The woman has to work even in her old age here. And on the map, on the wall behind, you can see that there is a wall map. And similarly here, an old woman, and again, she's represented as being respectable, but pretty marginal. And there's a very large, what we would think of as really rather imposing wall map behind her. So I think that probably we haven't paid enough attention to the fact that maps are in domestic spaces that we normally would associate with women. And they are not studio props. They seem to be part of women's everyday life as well as men's everyday life. And it's quite interesting. We can use these kind of sources more, I think, to find out about women and maps. Later, of course, we get lots of images. This is an American image and showing a sort of new modern woman in her automobile looking at the map. And she's not asking the man to find the way for her. They're discussing the route together, which is interesting. And of course, one of my favorite paintings here, the hikers, and they are leaders, I think we could say. It's quite interesting. I'm sure all the women here make sure they're wearing their hats when they go hiking. And you can see they've got sort of immaculate white socks here. So they're showing their kind of respectability, but they're showing their familiarity with maps. They're independent, they're out in the field with their knapsacks, so all their possessions there. And the map is part of their modernity, of their independence. And they were very at home consulting it. There are maps about women, and again, these tend to be quite late. Here we have a map about women's suffrage that started in the west of the United States, and here's Lady Liberty marching forward to enlighten the eastern states, so they give women a vote too. And here, sort of one of many modern maps we can find about showing cartographically what the status is of matters which matter particularly to women. I chose this one because it's about property ownership, which we've been talking about earlier. So there are plenty of those now, and there are ones of earlier dates as well. We're thinking about women as map historians, and here's a selection of books from the Chicago University Press, one of the main cartographic presses. Lots of women now writing about maps, which is really encouraging. And particularly, we find women as map librarians, journal editors, conveners of seminars in cartography. Map librarians, I really needed several slides. These are just some of the very many scholarly women who are involved as librarians and archivists and distinguished writers about maps in their capacities as map librarians and archivists are very, very significant national collections. These are not sort of obscure provincial collections. These are really, really important. And there are many women who are involved in editing journals, Catherine Delano Smith, and the two on the top, Katie Parker, who was speaking yesterday. I noticed at your seminar, and Jordana Dim have just taken over to Margamundi. Sarah Bendel, who's active in this city, and I'm there as well, which is rather vain, isn't it? But just sort of making the point that we convene seminars. And I think maybe it's significant that women are there in those supporting roles where they've traditionally found it easier to get a perch, if you like, in the scholarly world as sort of behind the scenes librarians and activists, which nonetheless gives them scope to do good work. And in a convening role. But I think that what I would really love is to ask your help to make sure that we are able to track down women in all those roles that I've tried to sketch out. We have, I can't imagine a better place to find cartographic knowledge gathered in one room. So please do help with that project. We'll, of course, be very glad to credit your help. But the act of recording women, I think, is still valuable even after all this time. So your help with that is much appreciated. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks. On your kind of list of bullets for things that women, relationships in women and maps, there isn't anything about political engagement. So you talked a bit about the suffrage stuff, but I'm thinking about the some of the highest impact maps. Eda Bay Wells's work in the US on civil rights mapping, lynchings and things, the anti-lynching campaign, the women's suffrage movement, whole house maps, Florence Kelly, all those sorts of things. So I wondered if that was something, the political campaigning aspect is implicit in what you're doing, or whether you think that is actually something that could be another kind of explicit thing where women have been probably, the suffrage movement was incredibly effective cartographically.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that as women emerged from the private sphere into the public sphere, they brought cartographic abilities with them. So in this work that we've been doing, for example, wrote on Octavia Hill, who was a really important social reformer and campaigner, and does a map in order to, she draws just the one map in order to get her sort of campaign for fresh air for poor people into the public domain. And again, her work is known to the Hull House Mappers, and they're again trying to get sort of social work, social reform into the public campaign. And then that spills over into things like suffrage. But it's interesting that it broke into the public sphere, first of all, in spheres which are thought to be extensions of the private sphere. So things like help to the poor is a kind of traditional womanly charitable act and gets transmuted into professional social action. And women bring their cartographic interests to bear there. And it's then at a second stage you get interest in sort of campaigning issues. And then by the time you get to the women's stats site, which I showed you, for example, I mean, they've got sort of maps on femicides, domestic violence, all kinds of campaigning things. So you're absolutely right that women have used maps as one of a number of tools. I think that they've been quite clever in sort of using all avenues available to them, one of which is maps. So yeah, and if you have any specific ideas, love to hear them. Thank you.
That was a fascinating talk, Liz. Thank you very much. Just where my colleague Andrew James at the National Archives found various records of women's employment in various map-making arms of government at the lower levels, and discussions about which aspects of map-making they could be involved in, and obviously the war affecting that as well. And various comments, correspondence about, well, they're doing such a good job, can't be a better rate, we can't, various discussions like that. So I think that actually also adds to that discussion, because there's evidence of exactly who was doing what, and how that expanded and what could work.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's a sort of really something that's coming out in a lot of commercial and public bodies, that women are involved in there. And of course, public bodies, we get another effect of marriage because we have the marriage bar.
Yes.
So,
well, there's also a lot of talk about that, and it's not worth training them or paying them
because they'll only get married. Yes. Yeah. So, have we got time?
Would your interest extend to women explorers, stroke surveyors, of whom we're having a few, particularly I think in the Middle East and maybe Africa, I'm not sure, who arguably potentially as part of their travels with these maps some sort of stage really went.
Yes, absolutely. They're really interesting. And, there's a connection which the colleague here has kindly drawn to us with women and social causes. There's another connection between women and mobility in general. And as women sort of acquire an ability, whether that's to move around in the car or to go hiking or to go traveling, that's another really strong theme coming through. So yes, I'd be delighted to know. Thank you.
Back there, should we just take those and move on?
Thank you, that's really interesting. I was wondering if a part of your research was to use this information as a kind of outreach to encourage more women into the industry in the future, because we're looking at this.
That's not something that I personally am involved in, but if other people want to take it and use it for that, I'd be absolutely delighted. Yeah.
Thanks, great talk, Liz. Really interesting. Just I suppose, I'm sure you're aware of the first or few genres of mapping where the women pilots are actually bottom margin. So that might be quite interesting. I haven't done any analysis on finding specific people, but that's interesting.
Yeah, and sort of women compilers, I mean, that is a very rich genre. Cycling back to our reform maps, I mean, the Charles Booth maps, there were a tremendous number of women involved in them. If you try and find out whether these people actually put their results on the map, that's impossible. I haven't been able to do that at all. Nobody knows who drew the Booth maps, as far as I can see. I don't know, maybe someone in this room does, but we know there was a project, we know who's involved in the project, we know there was a map, but the connection between the two, I don't know. I've been really trying to find out whether the women were involved in compiling that. So thank you for that.